The title of the talk is Developing AI Algorithms for Generating Diagnosis and Prognosis in Neurologic Disease. But really what I want to do to start off with is talk about the complexity of standard analysis techniques, and then what AI can potentially bring to the table, but also some of the current limitations. I don't think they're forever limitations, but current limitations that we need to keep our eyes out and focus on in order to leverage this technology and make it useful for us. So one important point is the complexity of any human endeavor, but we're going to specifically talk about bringing artificial intelligence, for example, into medicine, okay? Because what I'm going to talk about is a specific application, okay? And if you look at the various levels of complexity, when you're talking about imaging, first of all, you've got the left-hand side up there. I'm in the domain of medicine, and in that vast domain, I pulled out the domain of neurology, and in that still fairly vast domain, I'm in this domain of movement disorders, which is a very small segment of neurology. And then in that domain, there's people basically, they spend their career in this domain simply seeing movement disorders. And within that, we're looking at Parkinson's disease. And if you look at all of the shrinkages there, and then you take that tree back up, okay, to the vast complexity of the medical endeavor, you get some scale of what we're trying to do when we try to introduce something like a new algorithm for decision making in a field where you have all these trained decision makers that are on these small little leaves on this massive branching structure. But then we also have the right-hand side, right? So the right-hand side is we're talking about computation and physics and bringing in big data. Okay, some way of bringing in big data. That was the big phrase 7 years ago, right? It was big data, and now the new one is artificial intelligence. And the two go together, obviously. And so I'm going to grab imaging, which is a distinct and very specific part that is very, very complex. We can talk about genetics. We can talk about laboratory research. All of those, proteomics, all of those have their own variants of complexity. Imaging, similarly, is a quite complex domain. Within imaging, we've got multiple different kinds of imaging. One of my colleagues referred to and discussed a number of them, but we're going to come down to magnetic resonance imaging, and then specifically we're going to come down further to a specific kind of magnetic resonance image called diffusion-weighted imaging, and really trying to do a deep dive and see, well, what can we take out of this type of imaging, and why all these dives? Well, a deep diffusion-weighted image is at least a 5-dimensional data set, potentially larger depending on how you look at it or how you think about it. It's a very, very complex data set, and taking all these dimensions of data and applying them to a single question. If you go to a functional MRI, it's a 3-dimensional data set in time with other levels of complexity and connection. So it's a very high dimensional data set. So each one of these imaging data sets, extremely high dimension. We're going to focus on one, okay? And then I'm pulling out 2 specific algorithms, okay, from diffusion-weighted imaging of multiple ways that you can chop up this 5-dimensional data. These 2 specific algorithms really are different 4-dimensional ways of chopping up the 5-dimensional data, right? Because from a DTI, diffusion tensor imaging, you can get multiple different images, right? Multiple different 3-dimensional images. From NODI, another way, neurite orientation diffusion dispersion indexing. A year ago I couldn't say that, but you get another similar 4-dimensional collapse of a 5-dimensional data set, okay? So go back up that tree and think about where we came from, and we're down here and we're still highly, highly complex. One disease, a highly complex set of questions, right? And so basically, we're talking about an intersection of two different domains. When we're looking at genetics and humans, we're looking at imaging and humans. We're looking at these variable domains. Along the imaging domain, we've got signal and noise. Along the vertical, we've got human variability. And the combination between these two is extraordinarily complex endeavor, okay? So from this perspective, okay, like Plato's cave, right? We're sitting here, we're looking at, we see something, okay, and what is a disease? A disease is when we all look at a series of measurements and we all say those measurements in a person are abnormal, and they group together, and we call this a disease, okay? And when we look at a measurement, what's a measurement? A measurement is, we all agree that a set of signals, we all agree that to interpret a set of signals in a certain way, and we call that a measurement, okay? But then we go to the final question, which is what is a signal? And you know, I think I'm going to have to turn that over to Murat, but that's a very, very difficult question too. We're making a model. The model is inherently false, but some are useful, right? So structure of this talk. First, the question is, what are we measuring, okay? So I'm going to describe the disease, okay? I'm going to describe a disease, but I'm not sure it's all one disease, but we'll just call it all one disease for purposes of, because that's what we do. How we're measuring it, and then some statistical methodology, okay, and what those statistical methodology provides us, and then artificial intelligence and a deep learning approach, and what does that add, if anything? Well, it should add something. And it will add something, but the question is, do we have the capabilities of taking something that drives a car and have it drive a diagnosis? And those are two very different tasks, okay? So from the perspective of what we're measuring, okay? Clinically defined, Parkinson's disease is a neurodegenerative disease impacting 1 to 2% of people over the age of 65 with a cluster of motor findings, with a resting tremor, okay, with some stiffness and slowness, sometimes some problems with walking, a masked face, a variety of motor features caused by a deficiency of a chemical called dopamine in the brain, okay. That's one way of looking at it, okay, but alternatively, the pathology of Parkinson's disease originates in the gut and inhabits the brainstem and brain of about 15% of people over the age of 65. Some people develop symptoms and some people don't during life, and that seems to be related to the susceptibility factors that we don't quite understand, severity of the process, placement of the pathology. So in some people who have this pathology, we say they have Parkinson's disease. And the other people, if they don't have symptoms, we simply, we don't recognize them. They're the iceberg under the water, okay? Similar thing, by the way, is occurring in Alzheimer's, okay? There's a huge prevalence of the Alzheimer's pathology in the brain after a certain age, probably in people writing Supreme Court briefs, but there's no clinical manifestation, right? So the reality is that it's just, so some people appear to be very resilient to the process. Okay. So the brainstem in Parkinson's disease, there was a guy by the name of Brack who was German, and he looked at cross-sectional studies, okay, and developed a model that has informed the way we look at the condition Parkinson's disease. Essentially, Parkinson's is proposed to start in Brack's methodology in the gut, okay? Sometimes it sneaks in through the nose too, okay? But it's proposed to start in the gut and traverse up through the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, up through the vagal nerve. People who have vagotomies, lower incidence of Parkinson's disease. If your appendix is taken out, you have a lower incidence of Parkinson's disease. Why? We're still trying to figure that out, but there are theories, right? But it appears to start peripherally and travel centrally. It impacts the brainstem. It starts to travel up the brainstem. By the time the dumb neurologist makes a diagnosis, we're probably at stage 3 or 4 of Brock's disease. A stage 1 or 2 disease is pretty common and fairly prevalent in the population, like I said, about 15%. Most of the damage, it's interesting though, this pathology traverses up through the brainstem. It's a spreading pathology. Essentially, the most recent theories think about it as a prion-like process, right? Not exactly a prion, but what is a prion? Does anybody know what so a prion is when you have an abnormal protein that misfolds and has this odd and very disturbing property of when it contacts others of its own kind, it can cause those others to misfold, clump, and do other nasty things. And these proteins can traverse through from one neuron to the next, okay? And so once the process starts, the clock starts ticking, okay? But there's evidence, a lot of brain cells are filled with this abnormal pathology, but most of them are not dead, okay? So that's an important thing. It does do something though. It does, even when it doesn't kill the brain cells, it does something. So we had a sample that we could look at. Essentially, there's a Parkinson's Progressive Markers Initiative. It's like the ADNI data set. We have about 400 people who have clinically defined Parkinson's and about 200 healthy adults. So it's a reasonably good sample. We have imaging for about 100, and we have 5-year data for about 80. In the Parkinson's category, we have about in the 50s for the controls for the same kinds of things. We can break down the sample, okay? And when we break down the sample and start to look at, so I asked the question, what is the relationship between diagnostic observations at the beginning of disease and whether or not you got worse later, okay? So there's a very clear categorization, a division in the data in an old classification called the Hoehn-Yahr scale that's triggered by balance. And when people start to have problems with balance, they need a cane or a walker. They're said to transition to a particular state, Hoehn-Yahr 3, right? If you look 6 years ahead and find at any point in this study, over the 12 or so visits in that period of time, if at any point somebody said, hey, today this person needed a cane, okay? They fell into one category, and if they didn't need a cane, we stuck them in the other category, right? When you make that division, interesting thing pops up. Now, we knew this, okay? We knew that people who had problems with walking 6 years out, that they had a lot of, they were more disabled, okay? But whoops. And you could ascertain and expect that it must have started earlier and progressed. But here's a visualization of that. You can see these two groups diverging from the very beginning, okay? And the interesting thing is that currently, okay, there's not a way of when somebody walks in the door of saying, okay, you're in trouble, you're going to be worse in 5 years. At least not yet, but that's only because, we haven't published this stuff yet, because the reality is it's actually it's very easy to tell who's going to be in this category and who's not. I listened with interest to the speech because one of the things that comes up in the people who are in this category, they say, I've got a problem with my speech. Now, the neurologist doesn't see it, okay? Neurologist doesn't, but the person self-perceives they got a speech problem. They complain that they have lightheadedness, but the neurologist doesn't see that either. They actually have a number of different complaints, and those complaints, put them in this category. The walking problems actually don't. At this stage of disease, okay, walking problems are not a really good predictor because people typically with Parkinson's, they don't have that at the beginning. But a lot of these other things, lightheadedness, speech problems, self-identified. The green line down here is the healthy people, right? So we wanted to ask the question, what differentiates these folks? First of all, what differentiates the green, quote-unquote, healthy people from the blue and red, and what differentiates the blue people from the red people, okay? This, by the way, is about 22 to 25% of the sample, okay? These folks represent 3/4 of the sample. And that's another interesting point. Over 5 years under treatment, most people with Parkinson's really do quite a bit better. There's a clear difference. So, switching tracks, okay? I can talk now about our measurement, okay? So, we're using something called diffusion-weighted imaging. So, what is that? I like to be simplistic because if you're not, sometimes you confuse yourself, right? So what is a diffusion-weighted image? It's nothing less than a measurement technique using MRI based on repeatedly subtracting one signal from another signal, and the signal, in this case, is biased along a certain direction each time you do the measurement, right? So you subtract one signal from another, you get a measurement, and it turns out that that measurement has a relationship to diffusion of water. Diffusion of water is the strongest signal. And in the interval between the subtractions, water will either have moved a lot, a bit, or not so much at all, right? If we understand that water moves down tubes and not across barrels, right, we can then make the ascertainment that we're measuring something. And we've decided to agree in this case that DWI is a measure of neural tracts in the brain. Now, the interesting thing, of course, right, is that if I take a DWI of the breast, I'll get all these same signals, right? And I'll get diffusion characteristics and things like that, which can be similar values. But if I see it in the brain, I say, oh, if it's in the brain, it must be neural tracts, okay? So those are the assessments that those are the models I'm basing things on. Here's one four-dimensional collapse, okay? So I take all the diffusion directions and I collapse it into a single tensor, a flow, okay? That's a diffusion tensor image. I've got a long axis and I've got a cross-sectional axis, and all the bumpiness around the edge I just ignore. I create a smooth, football or basketball or golf ball, depending on how much fluid I've got and where the directions are going. But then I get back to my really difficult issue, which is I've got a bunch of people and all their brains look different. So I've got to somehow match all of these together. So we use a warping technique to warp and match and cluster and constellate, and so everybody's spot looks the same in every brain. And from that, we get a series of measurements from our tensor, okay? So another methodology that we use is NADI. This is another four-dimensional collapse. And here, I'm looking at the hairiness of the data, the cushballness, okay? So I lose the directional element. Instead, I'm looking at how spiky the data is. And you can see that up here, I've got this, the tensor looks like this, okay? But I've got a lot of cushiness, okay? I've got a cush ball here because I've got a lot of things going back and forth, okay? So NADI will kind of give me that versus this, okay? So this I interpret to mean that maybe that's neuronal or some cellularity index, okay? This is more like water, okay? So we did these analyses. We're looking at the brainstem, and we found something. And what we found, basically, is that people with early Parkinson's disease have differences in their diffusion signal and also differences in their Nadi signal in the brainstem. This is when they're walking in the door, okay? When they're walking in the door. These signals have different meanings. So now, as somebody looking at these signals, I then have to interpret what these signals mean. And I can tell you that these signals are largely these ones in neural tracts, in branches, in white matter, okay? In areas where one part of the brain is connecting to another. This is where axons are traversing, right? But I have a signal in gray matter, a Nadi signal, a signal of degeneration, okay, in gray matter. So most of my signals are problems, are in the axonal domain. Some of them are in the domain, one of them in particular is in the domain of basically where the neurons are, okay? And that's where we get to something that's a bit interesting, okay? Because these two groups differ in this neuronal marker, okay, in this particular area of the brain. Individuals with Parkinson's all show evidence of abnormal branching, okay? But some of them show evidence of dead tree trunks in the gray matter. And these are actually our groups. This is our healthy group. This is our group with, so they don't get off scot-free, right? But this is our group that's progressing slowly. This is our group that's progressing rapidly, okay? So they're losing cells. So it stands to reason that these would be groups that would be very difficult to tell apart at the beginning, okay? So if you're looking at the function of the individual, they're all losing branches, okay? Pretty much equally. But in some of them, the trunks are falling over, and those people later do worse, okay? So that gives us a model, right? That gives us a model. It gives us a way of kind of thinking about, okay, so we have this condition, and we have a divergence in this condition. We call all these people Parkinson's disease, but clearly we have a couple of groups. These groups have some different characteristics. The people who are going to progress, not only do they progress more rapidly in their gait and walking, but they also have a faster rate of cognitive progression. If anybody's aware of the MoCA, these folks are losing 3/4 of a point on their MoCA, okay? So MoCA scores from 0 to 30. If you score under a 26, it's considered abnormal, okay? So it's 26 or over is normal. These people, the people in the more rapidly progressive, they're losing 3/4 of a point on average on MoCA. So by 5 years, the average sample has moved into abnormal. The other folks don't have a significant change in their MoCA score. And that's replicated for memory. It's replicated for visual spatial. These people are progressing more rapidly, but across many domains. They're not just progressing more rapidly in their walking, but they're more anxious, okay, and they're cognitively progressing. So the point of going through all that, okay, was to say, okay, we did a bunch of really complicated things. We knew what we did. We looked at each point, okay. I skipped by this slide, but this is the analysis track. This damn thing took 5 years, okay, to do, right? And it was built, pretty much hand built by me as a bicycle with a lawnmower engine. Then I turned it over to some of Murat's people, and they built me a motorcycle, right? So essentially, this is a statistical methodology that was arduous and hard, and we dove through it, and we built this big. Now we can push a button, and something comes out the other end. But I know each way station along the end. There are no hidden layers in this process, and because I went through that arduous process, right? of scraping my knees and getting the wrong answers sometimes and not understanding stuff, I came to this point, right? These 2 points of insight, okay? I came to these 2 points of insight. That's what I want to talk about with respect to artificial intelligence, okay? How do we get insight from it? Because I can tell you, okay, I'm working with a number of people. We do an awful lot of AI. We can detect stroke and subarachnoid hemorrhage. We can detect Parkinson's disease. The algorithms, okay, and I'm not going to show you all the beautiful, I mean, there's there's all kinds of things. They're off the shelf, though. There's nothing special about them. It's really how you kludge them together, right? I feed this to that, and I have multiple together, and they all make a decision, and out comes my fortune cookie, right? That tells me what the answer is. So it was a little bit dispiriting when I'm sitting here and I have this, I come to the end of this, I'm like, I can make a prediction. I'm like 85 to 88% specific. And then I go over to my buddy David, and he drops it in a neural net. He says, yeah, me too, 85%, right? I said, well, why? He says, well, I don't know. That's just what it says, 85%, right? It's 85%. You can make a diagnosis. Why do you want to know why? It gave you the answer you wanted, right? So machine learning is, how does it drive a car? Nobody seems to want to know that, right? It's used to answer a broad array of questions, but we have to figure out how to help, how to give us the ability to get insight, okay? And I would love to have insight at the push of a button, instead of spending 5 years, kind of dragging my knees through the forest. So a deep learning will start with a series of raw images, and then you drop it in a neural net. By the way, that neural net has an awful lot of similarities with this top-down, reflex-driven statistical tree, right? But in this tree, I'm using statistics as all my decision makers. A neural net is too. It's using statistics, but it's a learning algorithm. It comes to a preordained conclusion based on a canonical preordained process. And here's where we loop back to the beginning, okay? Is a disease a disease? Is Parkinson's disease a disease? I actually seriously doubt it, right? I seriously doubt that Parkinson's disease is a disease. Parkinson's disease is a syndrome where if you happen to hit certain places in the brain, you get certain symptoms, and you have a variety of reasons why that might happen. It might be genetics in you, and it might be something else in somebody else. At the middle of it, there is some kind of protein, right, that's driving the process, but there are multiple different pathways into that. Genetics in the case of Michael Fox, and I'm not dishing on him. He's aware of that, right? And punches, right? Multiple punches to the head in the case of Muhammad Ali, and I'm not dishing on him either, right? He would readily acknowledge that, right? I'm quite familiar with followable models, being in this field of imaging for quite some time. When I started, okay, I had just come out of my fellowship, and I had all this data that was built on, interestingly enough, Doc Hollywood, a Doc Hollywood fundraiser and a bunch of chili cook-offs at the local Harley-Davidson motorcycle. And I had a bunch of data, and then all my analysts left. And I had to teach myself how to analyze data on my own, right, without a mentor, right? So I just started doing it, and I very quickly figured out, and I didn't publish this stuff, right? I very quickly figured out that I could make any picture I wanted to make by just changing the thresholds. and I could make a beautiful publishable paper, right? That would be, publishable in the literature. I couldn't do it, right? I wasn't chasing the funding cycle at that point. I hope I would still have those ethics, right? But I had to figure out how to get the signal to actually work. This is what my 11-year-old would call a sick burn, right? This is 2009. There were several laboratories that were using statistical analysis and not doing a lot of good due diligence on their error correction. And so a group basically took the same technique and stuck a dead salmon in the scanner and proved, using identical techniques, something about the mentalizing state, the mental state of the salmon. Okay, he got it into a very major conference, based pretty much on the title alone: Neural Correlates of Interspecies Perspective Taking in the Postmortem Atlantic Salmon, an Argument for Multiple Comparisons Correction. Right? And it caused a controversy, but it actually this one poster actually moves the field forward. Okay. So, what are our problems with neural nets, right? How do we move these things forward to being useful for us? And what we have to do first is we have to acknowledge where they have problems, okay? First of all, there's the obvious one, right? The obvious one is that we have hidden layers, and a hidden layer implicitly involves hidden assertions, okay? Hidden assertions that you don't really understand. So those hidden assertions, I've run into some of these assertions through my kind of knuckle-dragging kind of process when I had a high diagnostic capability on Parkinson's disease, but then when I went back to look at the statistics, what I understood was it's because people with Parkinson's, their neck tends to be bent, right? So I'm not trying to make a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease based on whether somebody has a bent neck, right? Neural net doesn't care, but I care about that because when my uncle goes in the scanner and he has a bent neck, I don't want him to be 100% likely to be diagnosed as Parkinson's disease. I don't want people to be diagnosed with attention deficit disorder because they tend to wiggle more, which is something that happened recently with I don't know if it was neural net based, but it was a big data approach to a large amount of data, and they said, hey, we can predict who has autism and who doesn't based on this fMRI study. And then because everything was open, because we saw all the hidden layers, somebody could go back, look at the data, say, well, you know what, you had an assertion there. I'm going to check that assertion out. You know what? Turns out that the hundreds of people who had autism wiggled more, and that's the signal you're picking up. You're picking up the signal of wiggling, right? And so if my son who has ADHD goes into the scanner, I don't want him to be diagnosed as having autism by an artificial neural net, okay? So hidden assertions, big problem, okay? Sample selection defects, okay? That's a huge one too. I could have an overly exclusive sample that includes no women and only Caucasians, right? This sample right here, this one, hang on. That sample right there has exactly 12 African Americans. 12. Okay? That's a Parkinson's Progressive Markers Initiative. 12 African Americans. In fact, it has a far higher prevalence of people who say, I'm not going to give you my gender, by like fourfold than, I don't know what that means, right? But than African Americans. Okay? So, you know, we deal with that, you know, but you can look at that. You can have overly inclusive sample, right? If I include dog brains, then my neural net will include the characteristics of dog brains in its analysis. then I can have modeling errors where basically I say I have Parkinson's and I don't have Parkinson's, and I have people who don't have it. And it may be that if I was going through the trenches, I would see the pattern that actually I don't have just one disease. Maybe I have multiple conditions or something that's, right? So I can get that insight by delving through the data. A neural net's not going to give me that. And the final, right, is just understanding the model itself, right? Here's something really interesting about neural nets that I've been aware of for a while, but I've been pondering for a long time. So these AI networks have been constructed and built and theorized for a very long time, okay? Why is it that suddenly they're driving cars? Because it's not really the intensity of the neural net that has changed. What has changed? The model changed. The model changed. Something very simple in the model changed, okay? In the early neural nets, the model was a sigmoid curve. And I'm still trying to figure out why this is the case. Murat keeps trying to explain it to me, and I'm not sure I understand. But the reality is that those sigmoid curves, just flopped around like noodles. They never converged, okay? Then somebody came along and said, the hell with that. I'm just going to make everything the lines. Everything's a linear regressor in a neural net. It's got a bunch of linear regressors. All of a sudden, they work. They can drive cars. They can make decisions, right? I go to a linear regressor, and they can make decisions. So I guess that's a bit reminiscent of differential calculus, but it's a fundamental fact that when we made all of our regressors linear, that's when neural nets became useful, right? Those basically are, that's basically what I wanted to talk about today. I mean, I could go through the structure of our neural nets and things like that. We've got several that do a variety of different things. In fact, we were not just limited to medicine. We've done a variety of competitions, including for Homeland Security. We've had some wins, some really big wins, but that doesn't necessarily give me the insight that I need to handle this, okay? And that's the work that we need to do going forward, is figuring out how to derive insight from neural nets. And we're working on it. Murat, I think that you had a few words that you were going to say.
Show the team first. We have to thank the team.
Yes, you're right. Must thank the team. A variety of people here, neurologists, engineers. We're working together to really try to get to go from the perspective of neural nets to useful neural nets. I mean, they're already useful to do things faster than humans, but they're not yet useful to provide us with insight. Not yet.
And first of all, did you mention his names?
I didn't go through all of them.
All right. So this is our team. The yellow ones are the professors, and the rest of it, depending on their areas, David, Thomas, John, and William are electrical engineering, electrical and computer engineering guys, and the rest of it spread around. So, since I have only 15 minutes, I was thinking that I can explain my theory in 15 minutes, 15 hours, 15 days, 15 months, maybe 15 years. So today we're selecting 15 minutes. Okay? Anybody has any questions, or after hearing what I'm going to say, potential collaborative possibilities, they can approach me afterwards. 15 years ago, I came to UAB approximately from University of Texas at Dallas, at University of Texas in Austin. And I used to go to Dallas to visit the Health Science Center there to collaborate with medical colleagues. My chairman, E.T. Austin, became a dean in Alabama. One day he called me, he says, "Hey buddy, you wanna come to Birmingham?" Well, rest is history, he convinced me. It's actually, if you haven't been there, Birmingham is a very beautiful place. If you go there, and if you like calm, green and clean water, clean air, you're gonna love it. So it's advertisement ends. Okay. 1980, my first neural network construction, I did in 1989. A company, the insurance company approached us, said, we need to detect a fraud. We think that neural networks can do it. Well, I didn't know about neural networks. So I had a colleague from MIT we just hired, young guy. He was in AI. I told him, do you think you can do something like this? He said, let's talk. So we talked to the guys. They gave us a computer. They said, this is $30,000 computer, 1989. And then my colleague took the challenge, and we constructed neural networks on that machine. The neural network software was already, this is a Sun workstation type of machine, and beefed up by extra memory, processors, type of stuff that they could do those years. Eventually, we did it, and it turned out they were happy. We didn't know what we did, but the insurance company liked it. After that experience, I realized that's not something I want to do. I never did anything else with neural networks after that. Okay? So, recently, when these neural networks again became so popular, mostly because of computational engines, and algorithms didn't change much, as Frank alluded, except that this fitting function changed. That's all, mathematically. But availability of a whole bunch of algorithms in the domain, high school level kids can download one of those algorithms. They run a neural network algorithm, they give you a result. So it's not a big deal these days. And interestingly, it's very good. They give good results like they did 30 years ago. So, but Frank is a fundamentalist. He wants to understand. He doesn't want to get just results. He wants to see what's going on with these things. And I feel the same way. So, now switching tracks. How can we see inside these things? Back in 1969, I was an undergraduate student, and I got a scholarship from German government, and I went to Germany as an intern, summertime, 1969, 50 years ago. And there was a guy in Jülich, near Aachen. There was a Kernforschungsanlage research institute there. They sent me there. I didn't know anything about it, like a young kid. There was a guy who was developing a book on partial differential equations, and he wants to develop computer programs in PL1, which I didn't know at the time. Only Fortran 2 was available to us in Turkey. I was in Turkey. So he said, we're going to write programs in PL1, and can you do this? I said, well, I don't have the choice, right? So I learned the PL1 language, and then I see this computer. IBM 360 Model 65. I had not recognized, I had first time seen a computer which was a supercomputer of the time. I could not believe it. We write the code, we give the code, we turn around, get the printout. In Turkey, I write my Fortran 2 code, give to the desk the cards, and then wait a couple of days. A couple of days later, I get a printout that says syntax error. So that was I could not believe the power of the computers. I forgot about the differential equations, forget about anything else. When I come back to Turkey, I told my department chairman, I said, look, I want to learn about computers. This thing is amazing. How can I do it? I mean, there was no computer science department in 1969. I think they just starting one in Carnegie Mellon. He said, okay, you cannot learn computers with electrical engineering only. He was a Sorbonne guy, okay? So he said, you know, I'm gonna design your program. So he designed me a computer program to learn mathematics, to learn electrical engineering, and he said, you have to also learn the biological aspects of computing. He gave me a couple of books. Norbert Wiener, Cybernetics, and in a German book called Menschenmaschinen, everything in German, and Herb Simon's just published book on sciences of artificial. He said, there's only one way you can learn about computers and computing. At the time, I didn't know the word computing, of course, studying all these things. So I started taking, luckily there was a new guy came from the United States doing the brain analysis using power spectra, EEGs, etc. So I studied those kind of things and, you know, studied systems theory and all those things. And I realized the only place to learn about computers to come to the United States. So I started looking at some kind of a scholarship or something to go to the United States. Well, cut the long story short, I got a scholarship from US government to study 2 years. They pay everything. They pay the tickets and they find me a university. So I end up, after a little bit of passing through Princeton, I end up in Texas A&M University. My advisor transferred there. So I started learning about computing. All these things, you know, like I go to school from 7 to 5. I take every course by registering, not registering the kind of things that I want to learn, because so crazy thing this computer was. So I can claim that I've been studying computing last 50 years. And single-mindedly, of course, by luck, turns of lucks, many lucky turns happen. One of those lucky turns, around 1995, George Kozmeski, I was in UT Austin, electrical engineering. Kozmeski was the founder of the Teledyne company, also former dean of management. He had an IC Square Institute he built with his own money, study multidisciplinary things. And as a young kid, and still young those years, you know, compared to George, we established Society for Design and Process Science. He connected us with Herb Simon. You know, he was the god of design. The Sciences of Artificial was actually 1995, based on 1995 lecture of the importance of design in engineering. So Herb Simon, George Kozmeski, and young kids like me and one other person, we end up establishing Society for Design and Process Science. And talking to, many years later, talking to Steven Weinberg, we come to conclusion that we have to follow Frank Wilczek, because in our good research group, we see Frank as the Feynman of our time. We would like to categorize his concepts. You know, I'm embarrassing him, but it's the truth. It's, you know, hidden truth, but now not much hidden anymore. It has to be done because of our times are so perilous, intellectually, unbelievable things happening. It started with comedy and turned into a little bit of, you know, bad taste. Now in the disgusting domain, I think it's so important for all of us scientists to take a stand, to create a level of sophistication, a little bit, and critical thinking and understanding on young people. And we strongly believe that Frank Wilczek's work, although it's been all over the place, has to be put into a context. You know, Michael Lipscomb here is working on that project, and so we are very thankful to Frank on this, and also I'm so happy he invited me to this extraordinary workshop to communicate our ideas to super audience here. You know, I'm having great time being here. So, changing tracks again. Let me check my notes. Okay. So, I have a theory of computing. This theory of computing named communication quantum dynamics. We call it, in short, communication dynamics. Fundamentally, there have been two types of ideas, which is based on the particle ideas and based on the wave ideas. If I can collect all the books and all the papers in the world, I pile here, excluding the non-scientific ones, you will find out that there will be only two piles. When you look deeply what kind of mathematics they use, what kind of fundamental assumptions they use, either the material particle assumption or the wave assumption. Some quantum guys will object to me, they say, Professor Tanik, you're not so smart. You don't know, you forgot quantum mechanics, they have both. Well, I say, okay, pick a quantum mechanic book, tear the pages of wave part and the particle part, we can still probably separate into two parts. So our ideas, all these, I call it gold standard of thinking, the axiomatic models, is centers on particles and waves. Is it possible to have another way of mathematically representing? Well, Einstein says very beautifully, he said once that, look, all scientific ideas is the refinement of everyday thoughts. What is an everyday thought? A particle, you know, the naive everyday thought, everything is particle. Okay, Earth is a particle, squeeze in one little dimensionless thing, okay? Oh, this desk is a particle, you know, everything is a particle. It's the first idea. The second one, of course, wave, again, everyday idea. Provided that you provide the appropriate mathematics to analyze these things and apply. Is there any other everyday idea, especially these days, to be appreciated? Well, because of cell phones, at least, communication is another everyday idea. It is pretty much appreciated for most people because they figured out they can communicate. Can we take the idea of communication, turn into an axiomatic, first principle, scientific mathematics, and apply it various things? That's what I've been doing the last 20 years. Last 20 years ago, I have the formula. It's a big matrix. It's a special case. The fast Fourier transform is the special case. It's a quantum matrix. It turns out I call it U matrix. And last 20 years, I'm looking for ways of applying these various, from genetics to the brain and neural networks, you know, all over the place. So in other words, I'm sticking my neck. I'm a computer guy, sticking my neck out to physics domain, medical domain to chat. Okay, I don't mind. It's beautiful because collecting the rewards. Okay, so another application of this particular way of thinking is that our perception, which I enjoyed the talks in the first day. It was amazing, a very impressive set of talks. The perception, in my mathematical view, the things that we see, as many people told yesterday, is not the way they look. You know, I came from a different angle to the same thing. It is different, totally. Our genetic and evolutionary preferences to capture the space in 3 dimensions and the time in color, therefore space plus time. When we look at any object, color object, actually that's a space-time object. And then if you can make the mathematics of space-time object properly, then you may see actually what it is. You may actually mathematically see, not with your brain, because brain cannot see these things. Pretty much like Frank mentioned Plato's cave. What is happening outside the cave, you can actually see or mathematically see. This is axiomatic foundation of these kind of things. So, as a result, this communication dynamics has various applications. I decided to write a grant proposal again. 20 years ago, year 2000, I wrote one to NSF. It was the fiber proposal, $5 million to develop frontiers in biology and medicine. I proposed to apply this technique, and then I passed the first phase, then invited to write the proposal. I wrote the proposal. One referee says, this formula, which was actually my quantum dynamics metrics, I just wrote in that two summations, some e to the I theta, these indices are quantum numbers. And one referee said, this formula is in every book. As a young, naive, stupid person, I wrote back, I said, who is this referee? If he showed me one book in quantum entropy theory, quantum mechanics, information theory, whatever it is, give me the name of the book, I'm gonna withdraw my proposal. You don't do this to NSF, So they reject my proposal. In fact, referee said, give me a couple of names to send. I said, send anybody you want. As a result, rejected, year 2000. And I'm writing another proposal now, since 2000. I never write one. I just ask my colleagues write, they put me in. So I got lots of grants and money and everything, but didn't write one. But now I'm writing, I'm wrapping up. I'm writing now on convergence. People developing the convergence section in NSF, last year, they find my name, they send me an email, we're designing a new division called convergence, can you help us in that? I told my dean, you go to this one, this is a good opportunity to go ground floor. So he went to see his sick father, and he sent somebody else, nothing came out. But right now, they established that division called convergence. It's important. This meeting is about convergence. So, therefore, anyone interested in this topic of convergence, you can Google it. And if you want to collaborate with me in one way or other on these things, you're welcome. After this talk, you can ask me a 15-hour version of this talk. Okay? Thank you very much.